Why did ordinary Germans commit genocide during Nazi rule? A talk by Yael Louise Deckel.
What we need to learn and explore is how these people, like ordinary citizens, could commit such crimes while believing that it was good. I'll be looking at the ideology. And I think if we want to analyse how the Germans could commit the crimes, it's important to focus on the actual ideology, because the Holocaust, it was driven by ideals. Well, a lot of it was obviously conformity and coercion. I'm not focusing on that specifically. I'm focused on people who actually drove the genocide and like people who like really committed to it. And I think it's important to focus on the people who were like ideological Nazis, because from them we can learn like how they could agree with something such as genocide and how they could do such atrocities while viewing it as ethically good. And I think if we understand why they could do it as ethically good, we can like learn more about ethics as a whole, like how it can be subverted and stuff. So as you can see in these images, they're all images of ordinary Germans, and I picked them to highlight just the fact that these people were ordinary people. So here's like these ordinary schoolboys around a book fire burning, the schoolboy with a drum, and just these like children, in a sense, jumping over a fire. All these people, ordinary people, could have been perpetrators of the Holocaust. And the thing is, when focusing on the Holocaust, it was very much an ideological driven. Obviously, people can kill others like through coercion and stuff, but the Nazis, they were like properly hate-filled, and they did it because they were motivated by what they saw as good. And what we need to learn and explore is how these people, like ordinary citizens, could commit such crimes while believing that it was good. So there are numerous sections of the ideology that we can look at, but for this talk, I'll be focusing on two specifically, which is the actual anti-Semitism, and I'm also focusing on values, so kind of like the Nazi ethics, because it's important not just to know the anti-Semitism, but how it links into the Nazis' definitions of good and bad. On to anti-Semitism. So for Nazi anti-Semitism, it's important to know the context that it was created in. I think when studying the Nazis, people focus on the time period, isolated alone. But if you look at like Germany before that, it reveals a lot and it gives like a deeper context because you understand the environment that it was created in. So Nazi anti-Semitism was pseudo-scientific based. So it was essentially racism, and it's different from other forms of anti-Semitism in Europe, because other forms of anti-Semitism had always been based around the actual religion of Judaism. But Nazi anti-Semitism was unique because it focused on them as a race, as the source of the hate against them. It's based off Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, as you can see here. It's based off the idea that humans, like animals in the wild, are in the survival of the fittest, and that like these humans have like evolutionized into like different races and they fight for survival, and that's why there's social conflict. And they believed that some human races were superior to others because of this evolution, and that forms the racism, but from a scientific perspective. And the thing is, this might be like very shocking for us, but back then it was like the standard. I mean, maybe not like social Darwinism, but Darwinism particularly, and like eugenics, which is like a very dystopian principle. It's the idea of trying to create the perfect human race by like killing other races as such, essentially genocide. So a lot of scientists and educated middle class in Germany, one reason that they agreed with the Nazi ideology is because many of them already agreed with social Darwinism and eugenics. In fact, it had been taught at most universities in Germany. So it was an accepted science at the time, that this is what people believed about like races and science at that point. And I think there was even like a eugenics society set up in Berlin, but they didn't have the huge influence they had in Nazi Germany. In Nazi anti-Semitism, they said that like Jews were like the worst race, and that they were kind of like a combination of all like the worst traits in every race. So in this way, they got what they viewed as scientific, but they made it into like an ethical thing. So they said, because we perceive Jews to be like an inferior race, like biologically, that must mean ethically they're inferior, and that if we want to create a superior Aryan, we need to exterminate them. And this also explains why they exterminated like disabled or LGBT or anyone that they thought would like threaten their creating like the perfect human. So yeah, I have this question at the bottom, and it says, does it count as racism if the racist views are factually supported? So I think when we look at the actual anti-Semitism in Nazi ideology, it is supported a lot by science that was considered science at the time. and facts. So that could explain how some people might view genocide a bit more differently, because they don't view it as like an attack on humans, they view it on like an attack on subhumans. And I think that's like a vital component of how people could perpetrate genocide, because genocide, to be able to do it, like most people are not evil creatures, I would say. Like we do have a natural tendency for empathy, but only for people we're close with, right? And I think the complete depersonalization and dehumanization of Jews was to such extent that they were able to just see them as like numbers, which is obviously shown through the death camps. One reason that they could have like rationally justified a genocide is because they saw it as like scientifically verifiable. So what the Nazis did, they said, because of this survival of the fittest happens naturally in the wild, why shouldn't we just try and do it, like implement it in like with humans? And it was very dystopian. Like they even set up like baby camps. I don't know if you know about that, of like Norwegian women who they viewed as like having desirable like Nordic genes, and they'll try and like populate like SS soldiers with Norwegian women to get like desirable babies, like literally baby factories. So their goal, what they saw it, genocide, was not for them like hateful. It was more like a scientific measure for utilitarianism, for humanity's like end goal. Another thing is scapegoating, which was a huge thing they did for anti-Semitism. Because Germany, you have to understand, politically, it was a mess. Like, I'm not even exaggerating. Like, even from the start, the unification of Germany as a country, they were divided like regionally, like socially, religiously. And the divide just never properly went away. And it had always been these like opposition. I think they kind of intensified in the First World War. And there was a lot of emotions around and a lot of hate, Treaty of Versailles. Climate of Germany was very complex and people were angry and they wanted a simple solution to direct their problems on. And this links into the scientific thing because it puts everything in a very black and white narrative. It's like these people are bad because their genes are bad. That must mean ethically they're bad. We need to get rid of them. You know what I mean? It's very simplistic narrative, but if you live in a very politically complex time, people want that. I think a good example to illustrate this is kind of like depersonalization and how they linked ethics with science was an SS officer. He was asked how they could kill the Jewish children. Even if they believed that Jews were bad, surely by looking at the children, they could see that they did nothing wrong, even if they believed the adults were bad. And he replied saying, oh, the children may have not done anything wrong, like the Jewish children, but they have like the Jewish blood in them and they'll grow up to become bad. So you can really see they thought that the personality was based on your genes, but they took it to such level. So they had like that scientific element, but also like politically, they wanted to blame it all on Jewish people because they were an easy scapegoat and they already had all that backing from science. So basically, before the Nazis rose to power, there was actually a socialist, well, communist uprising called the Spartacist Uprising. And it was very intense. Like it was huge scale opposition on the streets, very ugly fighting. They set up Soviets, like Germany very nearly became communist. And they were quickly suppressed, but Germany was literally splitting into like the far left and far right. And when the far right rose, eventually the Nazis, they were very quick to denounce the far left, right? They called them the November criminals. And of course, to fit their black and white vision of the world, they wanted to link everything into one source to make it their vision of the world clearer for others to understand. So they also linked socialism to Judaism. So I think there was like one or two like prominent socialists who were Jewish. So this one communist, he basically went to the state of Bavaria and created a Bavarian Republic. He was assassinated, but I think he was Jewish. And it was literally just like one or two cases like that. But they were able to create this kind of like stab in the back myth. Oh, is that a question in chat? So for Nazis, the Holocaust was scientifically justified. In one element, yeah, I'll be exploring others, but definitely in one way that they could have reasoned it was the fact that like, oh, this is like the laws of nature, pretty much. We are just implementing out for humans. So it was very dark. It was very dehumanization. It was very cold. And it was also very factually incorrect, as modern science has now proven. If we look at the actual values, I don't know if you can see the quote, might move that. Basically, what the quote is saying is that our views of ethics of good and bad is really dependent on the culture we live in. Like an easy example is like if someone's poor and live on the street, they'll view like stealing as good, but like a rich person might not if they've never had to steal to survive. And I think that again, by looking at Germany's history, you can see the seeds of Nazism already in there. Like I think people they put Germany on a pedestal a lot. Like they say Germany was so like because they want the Nazis shock people and they want to say like how much of a big contrast it was to the years before. Like they want to be like, oh, Germany was so intellectual, it was so democratic, like universal suffrage so early on, it's amazing, like how could it fall? But I think a lot of the main ideas that the Nazis had were already within German culture. And this is why people are more willing to accept them, and also why they are more likely to perpetrate such genocide because they didn't need like half as much convincing if they already believed in it. So obviously the science is an example, the political context can explain how the scapegoating could happen. And also, I think just like the culture in general, I mean, like the attitudes, because Germany was very like military culture. Like, I don't know if you know, but the country was literally founded through a series of war. And then it was like a total war of economy. And I know you can say like, oh, that's not unique to Germany. But I think if you look at the traditions and stuff, it's all about like militant and like strength and like, you know, so I think that can also explain the how people are more likely to desensitize, do you know what I mean? If it was already in the culture to kind of put your community above your personal feelings. It was very much a utilitarian culture. So if you don't know, utilitarianism is a theory, it's a philosophy that anything is good. It's like justified if it creates like the greater good for the greatest number. And for the Nazis, this was specifically for what they viewed as like the German people. So what I'm trying to get at is that for the Holocaust, they were able to see it as good because their definition of good was completely focused on what was good to like the ethnic German, like the Aryan German. A historian noted that Germany was going through an issue of identity. Because if you look at Germany's history, it was like non-stop turbulence. And it was like, what does it mean to be German if the borders are changing? There's different countries, it's like political divisions from the far left and far right. And I think Germany as a whole, like all the people, especially from World War One, that humiliating defeat, they were struggling. What does it mean to be German? And the Nazis solved this issue of identity through racism, which makes sense. If people didn't know what it meant to be German, and now the Nazis are saying we have this strict definition of what it means to be German, which is like blonde or Aryan. It like solves the problem in the way. So I think that's one reason that people could support them. Obviously, it's very hard to summarize it all because there's a million different possibilities, right? And for the Holocaust, I think by looking at what the Nazi soldiers did is that the reason they were able to do it is because they were able to justify it in their minds as good. I don't think like very few people would do bad stuff with the intention of doing bad stuff. Like I don't think the Nazis saw themselves as bad people. They weren't like moralists in a sense. They had ethics. They were just completely subverted to our standard of ethics. Like they were doing genocide because they saw it as the right thing to do to like save the people from the Jewish threat. And I think that level of depersonalization really shows in just the thoughts of the soldiers themselves. So there's this case of this Nazi soldier, and he had like a best friend who was Jewish, and then these Nazis came and they took his best friend away. And when he saw his best friend being taken away, he didn't think, oh, this is so horrible that they're doing this to him just because he's Jewish. He thought, oh, it's such a shame that my friend has to be Jewish. Ethics isn't just in actions, there's also in associations about things. And the fact is that they kind of, I don't want to say the word ruined, but they basically did ruin the word like Judaism. Like they had all these like negative connotations on what it means to be Jewish. And like, it was like, if you're labeled as Jewish, you're not even like seen as human. Do you know what I mean? It's like that level of depersonalization. Yeah, like I was saying, I think that a lot of the seeds were already there. But obviously, you can't claim that just because maybe the Nazis' ideas of eugenics were already into German society, it doesn't mean that they were at any moment able to like spring into a Holocaust. I think that like with history, it's very hard to track a specific outcome, because it's so dependent on like a multitude of interlinking factors that like it's almost impossible to say, oh, this is like a super clear outcome. And I think that though German society or like culture definitely had seeds of Nazism, and you can see where the ideas were like reflected people's existing ideas, I think that it really needed a trigger. I don't think that was enough to start the Holocaust. Do you know what I mean? Because like in reality, it's so complex, right? Like I think in 1919, as late as that, there was actually a German Democratic Party that was established to protect minorities such as Polish people and Jewish people. But I think on the whole, the majority, the reason that it was able to trigger is because just of the extreme radicalization that came from the failure of the First World War, because people were left extremely like betrayed. Like the Treaty of Versailles was extremely harsh, like economically they were suffering. They felt like the treaty had just been kind of forced with them. So everyone was feeling really angry and upset, and they needed a solution to that, which a bit darkly later they called the final solution. But I mean, it's that when people get radicalized, they take existing values and then they kind of like distort it and they enlarge it. Like the German people, they were scared of clearly losing their identity as Germans. They were scared of being threatened by others, right? Like if you look at Hitler's Mein Kampf book, I think he calls the final chapter like the right to self-defense when he's talking about Jewish people. So even though the Nazis go on about like their superiority of being Aryans, the whole ideology of like needing to protect the Aryans just reveals a big fear of being threatened by others. And I think when a group, if you study history, you notice this, that when a group goes into power, they always feel threatened by other groups that they feel that could oppose them. They already had these existing values. I mean, this is just my interpretation, but like they were radicalized to the point of like such hate and stuff that they just wanted a black and white solution, because I think the truth is just so complex. Like they feel like so betrayed by the failure of the World War One, and it's like, why? How could we lose that war? And then the truth could be like a multitude of different reasons, but then it's so much more like easier to swallow if they feel like, oh, this is one person to blame. And then it's just a very much like simplification of that. So this is a good quote I thought that kind of sums up by Goldhagen, the historian. He basically says he thinks the only way to understand how the Nazis or like perpetrators could commit the genocide is to understand the cultures that bred Nazism. He said this is why he thinks it's correct to refer to German perpetrators as ordinary Germans, because they were just regular Germans of the time. And I think, again, it's just really important to look at the context behind everything to understand how they could do it. So I have this question. So from their own perspective, the genocide was not immoral, but it was coherent with their own values, with their own Nazi ethics. Yeah, so they didn't commit the genocide because they actively indulged and liked being evil. They committed the genocide because they thought this was the good and that this was an instrumental good to create the best German society, one that was free from any inferior races that could threaten them. And they wanted to create a superior human, like just a superior human, superior German. They wanted to create a utopian German society. And what they did, they kind of simplified the world into black and white, because they'd gone through so much, like Germany. The literature was very kind of utopian. Like there was a big like folk utopian movement, I think, in the 19th century, where they would create like literature about envisioning like an amazing like German future where everyone's like unified and stuff. So the Nazis kind of took this and advocated it and said, if you want this future, we need to get rid of these people who threaten us. And they simplified it a lot and said that everything they did was putting towards creating this future, which is what people wanted. Do you think this could compare to the stance on ethics in modern day and the way people conform to that? Do you think we believe in ethics in the same way? How has it changed, like from then? So definitely, I think there's different forms of ethics, right? So like obviously there's deontology. So anyone who doesn't do philosophy, deontology basically says that an action is right or wrong, no matter the consequences it produces, it's just always wrong. So for example, killing would always be wrong. While utilitarianism, which is like an opposite theory to that, says the actions are good or right depending on the outcomes they produce entirely. So killing might be good in some situations and bad in another. And yeah, I think not, if we were to define the Nazi ethic, I would say it's probably a form of utilitarianism, because they would justify any immoral action as moral because of the good outcome that they saw it producing for the German population. Do we believe in ethics the same way? I think that the Holocaust has definitely challenged people's view of ethics. I think it shocked people how much evil and pain and destruction people can commit while convincing themselves that what they're doing is for the future good. I mean, we don't just see it in the Holocaust, we see it in other examples too, like persecution of other groups. But I think because it's so recent and the scale of the Holocaust has like incredibly shocked people, and I think it has led to the rise of, what's it called, like anti-realism in the 20th century, which is the view that there is no ethics at all, no good and bad, because people are realizing how socially constructed it is. Because if the Nazis were able to convince people that genocide is good, or if people were able to like passionately believe that killing someone is good, then I think that we have a problem, because it's like, does there exist an objective good and bad if it can be distorted so easily and used by others to like achieve such bad ends? I hope that answers your question. Any more?
The only question I would ask is how could they convince themselves that the evil is as good thing as they managed to convince themselves?
I think they did recognize that what they're doing was causing harm for people. Like, it's impossible. You can't be so disconnected from your surroundings so you can kill someone and not notice the suffering they're in. I think it's more that they were able to see it as kind of like a necessary evil in a way. I think it's the fact that like at least ideological Nazis were able to convince themselves to such level that they were legitimately biologically in a way being threatened by others. And I think science as well was a huge part in validating it as good, because people are very easily swayed by facts. Like there might be like, oh, I'm not racist, but science has shown that this race is more likely to have this disease, so they're more inferior. When people have ethical debates, they bring facts in a lot, such as like abortion. There are people on both sides who use facts just for their argument. So people base their ethical views a lot on facts, because obviously they want their ethics to be true about the world. So I think because they thought through their pseudoscience that Jews were like biologically inferior, this was able to help them justify it more in their mind, because they didn't see it as more as like an ethical evil they were doing, but more it's just like a natural biological process that would have happened anyway in the wild. But then I understand, because it's like, even if they think that biologically Jews were inferior, there has to be like reason and rationality can only take you so far. And I think it's very hard to draw the line between the point where they killed out of rationality, cold rationality, oh, these Jews are like biologically inferior, and out of emotively, like, I want an enemy, like a. Do you think that the Nazi ethics could take place again elsewhere? Are perpetrators so blinded by their own ideology that they kill others rationally? I don't think that the Nazi ethics could take place again elsewhere. I think that definitely there will definitely be other genocides in the future. I think there's some already happening in the world right now. But I think the Nazi ethics was very unique to the situation of Germany at the time. And you can see this because a lot of the ideas they preached about was already deep within German culture. And the reason the Nazi ethic was so persuasive is because it answered directly the problems of the current Germans at the time, who were so extreme and radicalized, they wanted a simple black and white answer. So I think there definitely will be other groups in the world, but I don't think it would ever be the form of Nazism. And I don't think it would probably take place in Germany again. Like, I know there are modern day like neo-Nazis, but they're not the same as the original Nazis, because they live in a completely different context and setting. They're going to view all the stuff differently depending on their like social views based on their upbringing. But there definitely is hate and radicalization in the world. And I think this is why it's really important to have a Holocaust Memorial Day, because with a lot of like political conflicts in the world, for example, a lot of people are getting radicalized, especially by social media. And the news, especially with their facts and like science, whatever, is distorting things very much into black and white. Like, this is the victim, this is the oppressor. So I think, well, the Holocaust, it's because it's so recent, it's definitely shocked people, or at least brought to like main media awareness of the horrors of scapegoating, like how far it can take people. I do see like very, very, very mild things that kind of relate to the Holocaust happening around us in modern world, like the fact of the scapegoating that happens all the time, the generalization, the dehumanization of like other groups, even if it's like very subtle. People need to be more aware of this, and this is why it's important to have a day like this, so people can highlight and like learn from the mistakes. Because unfortunately, if I was to summarize humanity up based on all of its history, I would say the one thing about humanity is that it never learns from its lessons in the past. And this is why history is so important, because if you don't learn from its lessons, it's just going to repeat in different forms. People, especially, getting very passionate about different causes. And I think it's good to have this passion. However, I think that if you simplify it all into a black and white, oppressor and victims, it's just very dangerous. It's a very slippery slope. And I think that really it's hard, especially if you're like a victim in a situation, to view your oppressor as human. But I think the only way to combat it is to kind of recognize like how complex it is, how everything is morally grey and very, very like deeply personalized people. Because once you understand that everyone is literally just human, you'll be able to like, for like more empathetic and connect with people more. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. I hope that was informative, and I wish you all a good evening.